Now, before we start talking about UV mapping this specific model, I want to get into some basic concepts of what UV mapping is and why we have to do it. So let me just start by saying that UV mapping is a necessary step we have to take with our 3D models in order to apply an image map to them, or what we call texturing them, so we can get color and various details on them other than details that are modeled into the object. So what we need to do when we UV map an object is we basically take a three-dimensional model and we cut it up so it lays flat, so we can then apply a image map or a texture to that 3D model. The best way to kind of think about UV mapping is to think of like a clothing pattern, or it's kind of like the opposite of a clothing pattern, where when we have a clothing pattern like this, we take a piece of fabric that is two-dimensional, a two-dimensional object, and we cut it up in a very specific way where we can then sew it and stitch it together. So it forms like this 3D model. So that's sort of like the basic concept of what you're doing when you're UV mapping an object. Otherwise, your textures just aren't going to apply, or your images are not going to apply to your 3D model appropriately. And though it is kind of a headache sometimes to UV map an object, it's a bit of a roadblock for a lot of people when they get into 3D modeling. They will kind of 3D model a bunch of things, and then once they get to the UVing part, they just stop and then they'll start 3D modeling something else. So it is kind of a hurdle you have to jump through, but it is a very necessary step to have a complete skill set in 3D modeling. And today we're going to kind of walk you through some of the steps for doing that. But for the most part, that's what it is, a way where we can cut up objects or cut up our three-dimensional model, so it can then lay flat and we can apply a two-dimensional texture to it. So let's then look at some primitive objects and just their default UVs, so you can kind of get an idea of what this looks like. If we just take a cube here, and let's go to our UV editor. So we're going to go to UV editing menu here, and we're going to click on our UV editor, which is this guy right here. And this brings up our UV menu, or sort of like our UV editing view. Now we'll cover a lot of the tools and stuff in here. But first I just want to kind of look at some basic examples of UV layouts. And you can see that this cube by default has a UV layout. And this UV layout is sort of unfolded like we would unfold a cardboard box, right? So if you were to take a cardboard box and cut it up so it lays flat, this is sort of what you could make it look like. And we'll find similar sort of things when we look at other primitives as well. So if we look at something like a cylinder, we can see that that is also sort of laid out in a way where it looks like if you were to cut this up yourself, you have the top and the bottom, and then you would put a slice down the side and sort of unfold it so it lays flat, right? So now let's look at a much more complicated example of a UV layout. So here I have a car that I've modeled, and this car is going to consist of multiple objects and multiple UVs or UV layouts for different parts of the car. So let's take a look at what these look like. So this particular car actually has a texture on it, but you can kind of get an idea of what the UV layout for this looks like. And there's actually a lot more to it than just this. I believe this UV layout contains everything except for the tires. Let's go ahead and select everything. And then we're going to deselect the tires. And that's what our UV layout for something a little bit more complicated is going to look like. And this is a great example because one very important concept in UV layout is to get all of your UV shells, so to speak. Each one of these little UV parts is what you would call a shell or an island. It's very important to get them packed as tightly in your UV space as possible. The reason for this is you generally have a set resolution or size for your image or texture that you're going to use. And if you're not sort of scrunching or not packing your UVs as tightly as possible onto that image map, then you're going to end up wasting a lot of pixels. As in, if you're putting this into a game, that game needs to sort of load all of those pixels. And eventually, if there's a lot of pixels that's not going to be using or not going to be rendered, right? Just empty pixels that aren't used for anything, that's going to eventually slow your game down if you have a lot of objects in your scene that are not using their UV area efficiently. Hopefully this will start to make a little bit more sense once we start doing a UV layout. But this is basically one of the major concepts of laying out UVs is that you want to pack your UVs as tightly into that space as possible. Now let's take a look at the model at hand, and let's talk about how we can start thinking about laying out this object and laying out the UVs. Now, the first thing I want to think about here is just looking at the 3D model before we even get into the UV layout menu, is how should I cut this object up in order for it to lay out properly? Well, the first thing we can think about is different materials. So if we are to look at our image plane here, or our reference that we had, let's just refresh that image. You can see that we have a few different materials here. We have a sort of gray plastic here and here. These are the same materials, our islands and our D-pad. And then you have like this sort of grippy texture on the face of our object. So it's sort of like two different materials. So one way I can cut this up is to sort of cut that area out and sort of put it away separately. Again, that's something that'll make a little bit more sense once we start using it. But the other thing I want to think about is how would I cut this up so it lays flat, right? So we want to start thinking about it like taking a pair of scissors to it and cutting a corner and then trying to lay it flat. So ideally, we're gonna cut the corners. We're gonna cut this whole entire piece here in half. And basically, we're gonna try to hide our UV seams by just cutting it apart on the corners and sort of the sharper hardened edges, so to speak. And that will make it a little bit easier to cut up our object. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like in our UV view. Before I do that, I want to take all of my objects except for my cord. And the reason I don't want to bring my cord into this is because my cord is going to have its own specific set of UVs. Whenever you create a pipe or wire like this using sweet mesh, it's going to have perfect UVs already. And I'll sort of explain that when we get to that part. But for now, let's go ahead and select all of these objects. And I'm going to do a mesh combine. So they are now all one object. We can go ahead and delete our history. So edit, delete all by type, or just delete by type history. And then we can look at our UVs. Now, one more thing before we look at our UVs, I want to just put big emphasis on this is that as you start doing your UVs for your 3D models, if you have any n-gons or any non-manifold geometry whatsoever in your model, there's certain functions that we're going to be using in the UV editor that you just cannot do. And you're going to be sort of working on your model and fixing your model a little bit as you're doing the UVs, because otherwise you're going to get to certain steps, and those steps you just can't do if you have n-gons or non-manifold geometry in your model. A lot of times doing UVs will expose a lot of issues that you weren't aware that you had. And then you have to sort of put your UVs on halt, fix those issues before you come back to working on your UVs again. So it's a very important thing to talk about. And if at any point when you're doing UVs, if you get errors in something, it's most likely because you have non-manifold geometry or n-gons, and you need to go back and fix the actual three-dimensional model before you move forward with doing your UVs. So let's go ahead with our model here selected and open up the UV editor, and it's going to look crazy. It's going to look like a mess, like it's this thing tied in a knot. And what's interesting about this is we can kind of see the remnants of the initial cube that we used to make our controller, right? We initially used a cube, and we can see the sort of initial UV layout for that. Now, when I first started doing UVs, one of the things that I would do is I would do an automatic map. Now, what an automatic map does is it looks at your model and it sort of cuts things up just depending on which angle they are. So if you do an automatic map with your model selected in your UV editing menu, you can come up here and just do automatic map. And it's going to look something like this. And you may think that that's not too bad. That looks pretty good, right? However, we can do a better job than this, than just the automatic map. And the one thing about the automatic map that's most sort of non-efficient for our UVs is that we're wasting a lot of pixel space, right? We don't have our UV shells packed into this UV space very tightly. So a basic automatic map generally is going to give you a very bad result. It may look okay if you're new to UVing or 3D modeling, but in general, a basic automatic map is going to give you a very bad result. Now, what I like to do instead is a simple planar map. So if we do a simple planar map, that will basically just map our entire model from one plane, and we'll get something that looks like this. Now, with that planar map still selected over here in our attribute editor, if you go to this planar polyplanar projection, we can kind of edit this planar map to get it looking a little bit more like a Nintendo controller rather than just sort of like this squashed box with a ribbon on top of it. So the first thing I want to do is sort of mess around with my rotate attributes. So let me zero out the rotate Y, and that kind of turns it on its side. So it kind of looks like we're looking at the back of it here. So let's then rotate it on the x-axis 90 degrees. And then we get something like that. So I think this is upside down. It's not just upside down. It looks like it's sort of mirrored, right? So if it was upside down, it would be the other direction. So let's do -90 instead. So now it's oriented the correct way. And I want to make my projection width and projection height the same value. And usually I go with the lower value. So we'll just round that down to 1.8. And we'll change our projection. Oop, that was 18. Let's do 1.8. And we'll change our projection width also to 1.8. And now we get something that is, it's a bit larger than we need it. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, we typically want to go with the higher value. So let me undo that. So we're at 5. Let's just round that up to 6. And for this one, we'll put that one as 6 as well. All right, so now we have something that looks a bit more like a controller. So before we move forward, let's talk about this window here that we have, and let's talk about some of the tools in the UV window. So I have these kind of pulled to the side a little bit so we can see both of our 3D view and our UV view here. And so we can talk about some of the settings in the UV window. Now I want to bring up the fact that your 3D view, or the colors of your 3D view, are going to change a bit depending on your UV view. And this will make sense here in a second. So for example, you'll see that my 3D view here has a little bit of a blue and a reddish color. As soon as I close my UV editor and click off of that, that goes away. Those colors go away. Those colors are only active when I have my UV editor open. So let's open that back up again, and let's look at some of our different display options. Most things here we can just sort of click on, and it will sort of give us an idea of what those settings are, but we'll just click on them anyway. So the first one just being a simple wireframe view. So we can just see the wireframe if that's what we want to do. The next one here being a shaded on wireframe. This is very useful because it will tell us if our UVs or parts of our model are facing the wrong direction, which in some cases can make our text appear backwards or mirrored. So you usually want to make sure that everything is facing the right direction. The next one here is going to show sort of like stretching that happens. This one becomes really important when you have something like a character model that you're working on, but we're not really working on that now. The next one will show your texture borders. That's something that I like to keep on because I like to know where my texture borders are. This one is shell borders. I'm not too concerned about having that one turned on. This one displays the grid off and on. This will isolate selection, and then we have a UV snapshot. We're not going to talk about these quite yet. And then over here, we have a few different views. This will turn our texture on and off. Currently, we do not have a texture on this or an image map on this, so we can leave that off. And then this checker pattern here will apply a checker pattern to our object, which we'll talk quite a bit more about this here in the future. We have some other options here, so we can expand these other options, and we have things that are pretty useful like pixel snapping, and we can adjust the gamma, and we can refresh our Photoshop files if we're using Photoshop files to texture. So there are some other more advanced tools there to use in that menu as well. And then over here on the right, you have your UV toolkit. This is where you're going to find all of your settings. This is going to look very familiar if you've used the modeling toolkit, right? Because you can select all of these different components like UVs, edges, and faces. We have various UV tools in here that we'll be using as well. I want you to think of this as a basic introduction to laying out UVs. So we're not going to get into more of these advanced tools, but we will in other videos when we are UVing something a bit more advanced. All right, so next I want to talk about the UV space. So UV space and 3D space, think about those as being two totally different dimensions. In a 3D space, you have 3 different axes, X, Y, and Z. And in UV space, you only have 2. You have U and V. And these do not affect each other the way that you may think at first. For example, if I were to grab a vertex here on my model and move it in my 3D view, we're not going to see it move in the UV view. And likewise, if I were to take a UV in my UV view and move it, we're not going to see it move in my 3D view. So you really need to think about these two objects existing in sort of like different universes or different dimensional spaces. And one, the points and faces moving one around does not affect the other. And the other thing about UV space is that typically as you're doing UVs, you want everything in your UV view here to exist in the 0 to 1 UV space. So that's this 0 here, right in the center of that UV space, and this 1. So not 0.1. We're not putting everything in this one square, which would be the 0 to 0.1 UV space. We want everything to exist within the 0 to 1 UV space, and also not the 0 to 10 UV space. Occasionally, I'll see people use the entire UV space, which we do not want to do, or they'll use just this upper right quadrant, which we also don't want to do. What we want to do, or what we want to use, is we want to have all of our UVs exist in this 0 to 1 UV space. Now you'd ask, well, why is it there if we're not supposed to use that space? The extra space is for multiple UV layouts or multiple textures that you can apply to a single model. So that's more of an advanced concept that we will get into in future videos. But for now, as you're UVing a single object, you can just focus on getting all of your UVs in the UV space, or in the 0 to 1 UV space. Now, what I like to do is use these areas as sort of like a working area. So the first thing I'm going to do is sort of shrink down my model for now, and I'm going to put this on the left side of my 0 to 1 UV space. So this is just sort of like my preference when it comes to working. I'll generally just put all of my stuff here, and then I'll work on it here. And then when I have parts done, I'll move them down here to this area. And then eventually I'll move them back up into the 0 to 1 UV space. So that's something else that will make sense a little bit more as we're working. But that's just how I like to work. It's completely preferential. And you can sort of choose your own way to stay organized if you like. But that's how I tend to work. So let's start here just by separating out our objects that are already separate, such as our buttons and our little panel behind our buttons there. So to do this, what I'm going to do, you can come up here and choose to select object by shell, right? And then we can just click on, say, one of our buttons, for example, and move this down. Another thing that you'll see me do quite a bit instead is in UV view or just in UV mode. Often what I'll do is I'll select one simple UV and then control right click and go to UV shell. And that will select the entire shell as well. That's sort of like just the old school way of doing things. And it's the way that I sort of learned how to do them. So I just want to point out that you may see me doing that a lot, rather than coming up here and clicking shell and just moving the UV shell. Now, as I move these things around, I do want them to be blue. If they're red, they're facing the wrong direction. So I want to make sure that these are blue. And if they are facing the wrong direction, I can come up here to my transform tool and I can flip them. So we have this flip option right here, and I flip, that turns red. That basically means that it's going to, it's facing the wrong direction. And if I have any sort of text or anything on that, that's going to show up backwards. So Just make sure as you're pulling things apart that they're blue. Now, if it does have this sort of pinkish purplish color, that just means you have overlapping UVs. So you have some UVs on top of other UVs. So let's grab this little back panel that we have here. Again, I'm going to go Control right click to UV shell and just move that down. And I'm just trying to separate things out a little bit as they are. So these are all separate now. The next thing I want to do is start cutting up my object, cutting up my UVs. So a couple different ways we can do that in our 3D view here. The easiest way is just to select the edge loop. So if I want to cut this all the way around, I can just double click to select that entire edge loop. And then I can come over here to cut and sew and just say cut. And that will cut those objects up. And then I can come back up to the top and select one and move it off from the other. Now in this situation, this one is showing up red because it is facing the wrong way. So I do want to flip this one. And now we have sort of all of our UVs separated out and they're showing up as blue, which is good. And now we can talk about cutting up our UVs a bit further. So the first thing that I want to cut out here, because I think it's going to be sort of like the most work here, is the little grip pad or this surface here on my model. And instead of just selecting the edges and cut, I'm actually going to use this feature or this tool here called the 3D Cut and Sew tool. And this is a really cool tool because when you activate it, it's going to give each one of your UV shells a different color. And basically to use this tool is you just go around in edge mode. And as you double click these edges, it's going to cut those for you. And you'll see that they're cut because that line will appear thicker. So that's your border edges. So I'm just going to come all the way around here and just double click until I cut the entire face off. And again, we're paying attention to those thick lines. Occasionally you may click something like that you don't want to cut. You can just undo that. And sometimes you have to zoom in fairly close to these. If you do cut something that you don't want to cut, you can just hold down Control and sort of uncut that. And you do, when you click on that last edge to cut it, then we see that that whole thing changes color, meaning that that is now a separate UV shell, and we've cut that UV shell completely off of the object that it was connected to. So now I'm going to continue using that, just cutting around my button islands here. Whoops. And one by one, I'm going to cut. Okay, I did that one on an accident. Some of these you have to really sort of zoom into to click on them in the right spot, especially if your geometry is really tight. And as soon as I click on that last one, we'll see it change colors, meaning that that is a disconnected UV shell now. And again, I'm just double clicking around these corners. until we see them change colors like that. That one was super easy. All right, so now we have that piece of UVs completely cut off, so we can grab this with our shell button here and just move that away. And for the most part, this one is done. I don't really need to do anything extra to this one. So I'm just going to move this one down here. I'm also going to move this one down because I don't really need to do anything extra to this one either. This is just sort of our back plate that's just going to be black. I'm eventually going to shrink that down anyway. So now let's think about some of our more complex objects. So let's think about, let's start with just the back here. So for the back, what I want to do is I want to cut the corners. And I want to pick the right corner I want to cut. I think I want to cut this corner here because it kind of goes into that edge there. So you can do this two different ways. Again, I think I'm just going to do it by selecting the edges. And I want to try to get the same corners all the way around. So it's going to be this one. Like that. And then we'll come down here and just cut those. And then we want to do something called unfold. So I'm going to select this entire shell. We can also just marquee select over all of those UVs. And I want to go to my unfold menu here and just click unfold. And we get something like this. So this is just basically an automated thing that went through and just sort of laid everything flat for us. Now, the one thing I don't want on here is this little circular part. I want to join that back up with its other half. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that off. So from here, we can just select those edges and do cut. And then we can select that entire UV shell. And I'm going to move this back over here for now. And one more time, I'm going to just select all of these UVs and do an unfold like this. And I want to try to get this as straight as possible before I move it down to my little area, work area down here. Okay, so now we can do sort of the same thing for this guy. This is the top part. So I also want to cut along its corners. And we'll try to just do those same corners there. I'm selecting them in my 3D view because it's kind of hard to see them in my 2D view or my UV view. Kind of a tongue twister. And I don't want to select them all the way up, just to kind of the point where it turns flat. So just those three. And we're going to do cut. Select them all. We'll do an unfold. That will unfold like that. And I want to do a few things here. I want to cut off the little notch because that's making my UVs kind of stretch out in a certain way that I don't quite like. And I also want to cut off the circle here again. So let's just select those edges around that notch and the circle. And cut those off. Looks like I forgot one there. Cut. And again, they'll change colors when you know you have them completely cut off, because they will then be a different UV shell. And I'm just going to put these back over here. I'll put this guy here so I know I can combine those back together. And we'll move this guy over here too. Okay, so then I can try to unfold this again, and we'll get something like this. Now again, I want this to be fairly straight, or as straight as possible. And now what you can do is if you want certain parts of your UVs to kind of conform to a certain shape, for example, I can just select these UVs along this edge. And I can align them with our alignment tools. And those are going to be under, if I can find them. Align and snap. So here at the very bottom, I can align these to, we'll align them to the bottommost UV. I can do the same thing with these. And this is just if you sort of want to maintain the shape. So I'll align those to the top. Align those to the right side. And align those to the left. And then if we want, we can we'll actually just leave the corners here. So then what we can do when we unfold is we'll select all of our UVs here, except for the ones that we want to sort of maintain the shape of. All right, so we'll just deselect the ones that we want to hold the shape of. And then we'll do an unfold with only those selected. And that will kind of maintain that shape a little bit, as good as possible. I think a good idea here would be to just do one side at a time. So we'll just sort of deselect these top UVs and then unfold them. Let me get that one in the corner right there. Unfold. And then I will deselect, or let's grab these and line them up. But anyway, this is a great way to sort of just line things up. If you want things to continue to be straight, you can line them up. Another thing that we can do is if we back all the way back up before we unfolded those initially, this may actually be probably the better step to do for this. So I'm going to undo all the way back when we had our original shape. If I can back up that far. There we go. So now instead of unfolding everything here, I'm going to deselect those edges or those UVs along that edge, the inside edge, so that maintains its perfect shape. All right, so now we'll do an unfold. We get something like that. So let's go ahead and cut these parts off here and here. Move those out of the way. And once more, I'll just select everything. We'll deselect those verts or UVs that we don't want to unfold. Oops. So you can kind of get an idea here just by watching me how tedious and time consuming UVs are, but they are absolutely a necessary step. I suggest just learning how to do them, getting good at them, because then you're going to be faster at doing a UV layout, and you won't be spending so much time being frustrated by them. And no matter what app that you're using, whether you're using Blender or Maya or Cinema 4D, UVs are always a necessary evil. You're always going to have to do them. Now, another thing I want to check here is I want to turn on this checker pattern, and I want to look at the checker pattern on the 3D model just to see if there's anything that's stretching a lot. I can see that there's a little bit of stretching and weird stuff right here. I'm not super concerned with that at the moment. I think that's a reasonable amount of stretch. But I don't want anything to be stretching a lot. So I think that's a reasonable amount there. All right, so we're done with that part. We can move that down here. And let's see if we can, this guy, I think we can do an unfold on that. And then this guy is pretty much going to be done. That's our little notch. These guys, now let's talk about sewing things back together in your UV space. So if I go to edge mode and I select these edges, notice how those edges also get selected. That's because they are the same edge, right? So these edges exist in the same spot in 3D space. So they may appear to be different edges in UV space, but they're the same edge in 3D space. So I can just select one of these edges here and do a sew, and it's going to sew those together. We'll select the other ones as well. And you can also do, instead of just sew, we can do stitch together, and that will kind of move them into place. And then we can sew those. And now we can go to our UVs and we can unfold, right? And that unfolded great. So let's move this over here to our finished UVs as well. And then we can look at, let's look at our buttons, because I think they're going to be a bit easier. And some of these may just unfold fine the way they are. Like, for example, our A and B buttons here. I think we could probably get away, and we'll try our start and select buttons as well. I think we can get away with just selecting them as they are and do an unfold. And that will probably turn out fine for this situation. Now, In more advanced cases, that's probably not okay. But in our situation, I think this is completely fine. So we'll move these over into our finished pile. This one may get a little bit more complicated. We can certainly try just selecting it and doing an unfold, but it doesn't quite look right, right? And we're going to start seeing here in our 3D view, we're going to see these squares getting a little stretched and a little wobbly. So we want to try to do this a bit differently. And I think the way I want to do this is actually cut the top surface of that D-pad off, and UV it on its own, and then we'll UV the outer surface on its own. So let's just grab our entire outer ring here and do cut. And then with this whole thing selected here, we'll do another unfold. And that looks much more like what we want to see. This one, in order for it to unfold correctly, we're going to have to give it one more cut. We could try just unfolding it like that. And that actually doesn't look too bad. But I think I want to try giving this one more cut. So I'm just going to pick any edge and cut it. And we may actually want to cut this up a bit more, actually. I think I will. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to cut every inside corner. Again, we want to try to hide our seams as much as possible. And I think these inside corners here are sort of like the least visible part of where our seam would be. So I'm going to cut those, and we'll just select all of those at once and do unfold. And we'll get something like this, right? And these are all separate shells. So these are now going to go into the done pile. And now we can look at these. Now, these are a little bit more difficult because they have an interior and an exterior, meaning there is an inside here and that's the outside, and there's an inside surface. Now, I can certainly try just grabbing this whole thing and doing an unfold, but we're not going to get a great result from that. So I want to try to cut this up a little bit. And I could probably just cut it up from each corner, sort of like I did with the controller here. So, or the actual D-pad button. So let's try that. So let's just try to select these edges that go from the inside and the outside. So let's try to get all of those selected. And again, I think the seams are going to be most hidden in those corners like that. So we'll select those. We'll do a cut. We'll grab all of those and we'll do a unfold. And I think that's going to be just fine. And then for these, what I think I want to do is just cut actually, let's grab this whole thing. Let's try to just do a simple unfold on this one just to see what it looks like. This actually doesn't look too bad. Now you see that there is some crazy stuff going on in here. So even though it doesn't look too bad here, it is causing some issues with how wobbly this checker pattern is. So I may want to deal with that. I think what I'm going to do is cut the inside here of the inside area of these buttons. I'm just going to cut these off like so. And then we'll do another unfold and see how that looks, right? And you can see as we sort of separate things out a little bit, that wobbliness starts to go away because the shape has to conform and stretch a lot less to keep its shape. And again, I want to kind of straighten things up as much as possible. But these can now be considered done. So I'm going to grab them and move them to the done pile. And then we just have these two guys that are left. So I can try the same thing for these. I can just select them and do an unfold on them. To see how that looks. And it actually doesn't look too bad. I think we can kind of keep these as they are. Just want to straighten them out a little bit. And move those down to our done pile. We can then grab these and move these up here. And next we'll talk about how to arrange these in a way where they kind of fit together optimally and make sure we get them to be all of the same texel size or texel density. Okay, so next I want to explain the concept of texel density. So texel density is basically the concept of having the right amount of pixels per distance or per space. So for example, let me close my UV view here for a second. Say we have two spheres or two objects. So let's use two cubes. Right? And one is much bigger than the other. Looks like I accidentally created NURBS cubes. So let me go to poly modeling and create some poly cubes. So we'll say this one is a house and this one is a big office building. And now say, for example, we apply the same size or same resolution image map to both of these. So let's, just for the sake of explaining this a bit better, let's go ahead and combine these. Let's open up our UV editor and let's apply that checker pattern to them. So we can imagine here that each one of these squares is a pixel in our image. Here we have a much smaller amount of pixels, or they're smaller and tighter together, and here they're larger and further apart. If we applied the same size or resolution image map to both of these, this one would end up looking very blurry and very low resolution compared to this one. Right? Because the amount of resolution this one has on its entire face, this one has that same amount of resolution on its entire face. So if we're looking at this from the side, like this space right here should have the same amount of pixels as this space. So that's the basic concept of texel density and texel resolution. But that also applies to a single model, right? When it comes to UV shells. So for example, if I were to take this part of my model and shrink it way down, right? Those squares now are a lot larger on this part of the model than everywhere else. So that means this is going to be much lower resolution than the rest of the model. So this area is going to look very blurry, and everything else is going to look nice and crisp and highly detailed. And we don't really want that. We want everything to have a sort of equal amount of resolution across the board. So Maya makes it really easy for us to do that. All we have to do is select all of our UVs. We come to the Tools palette under Transform Tools, and we have this Texel Density option here. What we need to do is put in our map size. So we'll probably do a 4096 map for this model. And we're going to do Get and Set. And when you do that, it's going to resize everything to have the same exact Texel density, which is great. Now, the one object in here that we don't care about the textile density as much is this panel right here. This is just sort of a back panel that's just going to be purely black. We don't care the resolution of this because we're just going to look at it and see one color, which is black. So in that case, I can take this guy, shrink it way down, and then save some of my UV space for that. Now, for the rest of this stuff, we can start sort of just packing it in as tightly as possible to this 0 to 1 UV space. So the way I like to do this, again, is just one by one. I'll grab one of my UV shells and we'll move that up. So like we'll move this guy right around here, and see that's a little bit bigger than the 0 to 1 UV space. See, it pops out. So I want to scale this down a little bit. But if I scale just this piece down, then I have to reset my texel density. So instead of just scaling this one piece down, I'm going to scale everything down together so it fits into that 1-to-1 UV space like that. Now this is a step that you can wait till the end to do. You don't have to do it right away. Completely up to you. And rather than letting all of this empty space inside of here go to waste, I'm going to take this part of my model and put that right there on the inside. I could even sort of move that around a little bit so I have more room for other parts of my model. And I may do that as well. And I'm basically just going to start arranging things so they fit in here as tightly as possible. And this is a really good time to just use your UV shell selection mode, because you can very easily just grab parts here and kind of move them around. So for example, I can grab my buttons. They don't quite fit in there, right? They do. Yeah, they do. They fit. Okay, so we'll just put those right in there. And the other thing I like to do as I'm laying out my UVs is I try to sort of put things where they belong, meaning they're close to their spot in 3D space as they are in two-dimensional space. Now I do notice that these are a little bit bigger around the side. So I think I'm going to need to scale this one up a little bit. So those squares are about the same size. You can see here in my 3D view where this one's a bit longer than that one. And where the seams are is where your texel density being the same is the most important, because I don't want this to be an obvious line where this is a lower resolution than that is. So for this case, I'm just going to kind of manually scale that up until those are about the same size here. I'm not looking at just their size here. It's just sort of a coincidence that they end up being about that same size. Whoop. Right, so something about like that is better. I just don't want them to be too different. I can also grab this and use my rotate options here to flip this around. So it's kind of in the same position for that little circle right there. I could even take this circle if it fits and put it right there in that spot. Let's rotate it around a little bit. So that fits perfectly right in there. See, that's not going to fit in there. So let's try to get that to fit somewhere else. We may need to just rotate it a little bit like that. Same with these guys. You know, it's sort of like putting a puzzle together at this point or playing Tetris. I just want everything to fit together as tightly as possible. There are going to be some blank spaces, but I do want it to fit together as tightly as possible. You know, in some situations that may not work, or we may need to rotate things around a little bit to get it to work. That might fit if we really squeeze them in there. I don't want them too tight. I don't want their lines touching. I want to give them at least like 2 or 3 pixels in between, just to account for any sort of overlap when I'm texturing. Yeah, so I think those fit in there just fine. Here's our notch. I don't think that will fit in the spot, so we'll just put it right there. And then we'll grab these guys and let's just sort of try to arrange them properly. A lot of times this is a lot like putting a puzzle together. It can be kind of therapeutic at times if you want to think about it that way, for sure. But I try to keep the similar parts together. And then we just have these guys left here. Now, I don't believe there's ever such a thing as a perfect UV layout. I think there's always going to be ways you can do it a bit differently. There's always going to be spots that could be improved. There's always going to be a different, more efficient way. I think only, a supercomputer can do a UV layout most efficiently. And even then, I think there's a way that a human could improve upon it. So don't get too caught up in making this absolutely the most perfect thing that ever existed. You're always going to have a little bit of empty space. The way that I like to think about the empty space is, well, if I ever want to add something to my model, I have space for it. As long as it's not like sort of a blatant waste of space, I think you're fine. Now, before we finish this UV layout up, this is pretty much finished here. I want to look at the chord. So let's look at the chord here on its own. Now, the really cool thing about UV layouts for the sweep mesh is they come sort of predetermined with pretty much perfect UV layouts already. So this one, if we look at the checker pattern on this, see if we can see the checkers on here. We don't really see much of a checker pattern on this one. There it is. So we're going to need to sort of scale this way up to actually get the texel density right on this. So let's start by scaling it this way. Then we can scale it up. And this, you may have to scale this way up, right, to get those squares to the point where they look square, right? I think somewhere around there looks pretty good. But the cool thing about sweep mesh is by default, it's going to give you a really nice straight UV layout for your model. So this is the cord. I'm going to move this to the side right here. And now I'm going to combine it with our controller. So I just wanted to do that separately so you can sort of see how the UV layout affects cords. And I like to do those separately at first, because as soon as we do like a planar map or an automatic map on this cord, it's going to mess up that great default UV layout that we already have. So let's go ahead and select those together and do a mesh combine. So there's a one object. And the cord is going to be just a lower texel density object. We could do it on a separate UV layout, but I think we're going to just leave this as it is and place it right up here. Now, the last thing we're going to do to finish this off is we're going to select everything. You can see that we're not quite filling out the 0 to 1 UV space. We have probably a block and a half here, and we have about a block and a half up here. So I'm going to select everything. I'm going to move it right into the center of that 0 to 1 UV space, and I'm going to scale everything up together until we can get it as tight in there as possible, using as much space as possible. And we may have to move things around a bit more once we get them in there. Right, so that's pretty close. I want this one to come over a little bit more, meaning we need to bring this guy over. It may not fit in there. Let's get a close look at that. Yeah, we can get that to fit. If we have to, we can move this up a tad. And there we go. There is our finished UV layout. Let's hit save so we don't lose our work. Now, looking at this, sure, there's ways that we could possibly do this better. There's ways for us to improve it. I think this is pretty good, especially if it's the first UV layout that you've done. But the main thing to keep in mind is that everything looks nice and straight. All your checker pattern here looks nice and straight. There's nothing that's like really warped out of position. You want to make sure that all of your squares are about the same size. You want to make sure that everything is blue, not red. And you want to make sure that everything is sort of packed into your UV space as tightly as possible, without any like blatant waste of spaces. And that's our UV layout. Next, we're going to bring this model into Substance Painter, and we'll talk briefly about just the basics of Substance Painter, and we'll texture this or color it in Substance Painter.